Boom. Hello, everyone, students of SEASSI and SEASSI. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a talk from our guest, Baladas Ghoshal. Baladas Ghoshal is a doyen of Southeast Asian Studies in India, is a former professor of Southeast Asia and Southwest Pacific Studies, and chairman of the Center for South and Southeast Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, India. He was an ICCR chair in Indian Studies at the Russian State University for the Humanities in Moscow in 2013, and is also an honorary distinguished fellow of the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, as well as a visiting senior fellow in the Center for Policy Research. Since August 2016, he's also been a visiting professor of public policy in Amity University in Noida, also outside of the Delhi area. Between 2004 and 2007, he was a visiting professor of international relations, first at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and then at the Nagoya City University. He's further taught at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, National University of Malaysia, University of Malaya, and the University Utara Malaysia. He has held senior Fulbright fellowships at Cornell and Rutgers universities. He's a fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, Center for Asian Studies at the University of Hong Kong, in the East-West Center of Hawaii, consultant to the United Nations support faculty for Indonesian recovery. Further, he has been support faculty, has published extensively on Indonesian politics, ASEAN, and regional security issues. He has published extensively, I'm so sorry, my friends. Reads, writes, and speaks both Malay and Bahasa Indonesia. Also has published on Indian and Bangladesh politics and foreign policy. Among recent publications are a book on India-Indonesian relations published by the Institute of South Asian Studies, Singapore, and a monograph on China's perception of India's Look East policy, brought out by the Institute of Defense Studies and Analyses in New Delhi, and an edited volume, The Indo-Pacific Axis, Peace, Prosperity, or Conflict, published in April of 2018. He has completed a project on maritime diplomacy, international cooperation among BIMSTEC, ASEAN, and IORA, funded by Niti Aayog. He is also currently working on two major projects, one on India's engagement with the Indo-Pacific and the other on the Arabization of Islam in Asia. His talk today is entitled The Future of Asia Amidst a Turbulent World. Please join me in welcoming Professor Baladas Ghoshal.
Thank you very much, Scott, for a very generous introduction of mine. And also thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present some of my ideas on the subject, Future of Asia. The predictions or projections on the future is always very hazardous, because you never know what is going to happen in between. Some of the developments that we are talking about might go just haywire because of certain new developments. But even then, I think we social scientists, we do try to sometimes talk about the future, and we can at least flag out some of the major trends that affect political, economic, and strategic developments in Asia. Why Asia? I chose for this particular subject because, immediately after the Cold War, and also before that, there were historians and economists who have been really talking about the rise of Asia. And this was essentially caused by the unprecedented developments, economic developments, particularly in China and some of the Southeast Asian countries. Many of them attained, double-digit growth in the 70s and 80s and achieved tremendous economic prosperity as well as political stability. There's another reason also why one talks about the future of Asia. I think that is that from the first century until the 18th century, the world was dominated more by Asia than by the rest of the world. In fact, China and India were the most productive countries during that period and had a GDP or a rate of growth much faster until that time. Then, of course, the colonial period intervened and a whole lot of things happened. And the result was that Asia went into decline in terms of economy, and also because of colonialism, politically also became subservient to the colonial masters. Then in the post-Second World War period, you see the re-emergence of many of these countries as independent entities, and they tried to carve out a role for themselves in the global, Committee of Nations. Then you see happened the rise of China. I mean, at that time, of course, it was called the peaceful rise. And of course, then subsequently, trends began to change. But one thing one can't deny, the kind of economic prosperity that China attained in the post-1980 period with Deng Xiaoping's change of, the reforms and various other things. And ultimately, China became actually the factory of the world, the manufacturing hub of the world, in which I think America played a very important role for the rise of China. And maybe they should regret it also at some point of time, that they were the ones who created sometimes even a Frankenstein out of China. And with the kind of problems that one sees today, that, the kind of tension that is going on between China and United States, I think America may not have anticipated that at that point of time when it really championed the cause of China as a major source of investment. And all the Western powers, including Japan, began to, invest in China and some of the countries of Asia as well, because of the cheap labor and also because of the fact that many of the luxurious goods that could be available at a much cheaper rate. And that's one of the reasons I think China became one of the fastest growing states in the world. Now, what I'll do, because we are talking about the future of Asia, and I'll try to look at it from three different angles and from three different perspectives. First, I'll talk about the economic perspective and how economists are trying to project the future of Asia. And I think it will be what I'll do, like a telegraphic kind of thing. I'll try to sort of read out some of the basic facts and figures that I have sort of outlined here. And that will give you an idea why people talk about the Asian century or the future of Asia at that time. But that doesn't mean, of course, that it may not go awry also because of certain developments that are taking place now with this war in Ukraine and Hamas's attack on Israel and the subsequent sort of attack by Israel and various other developments. And one of the developments that is also going to affect Asia to a very large extent is the climate change. And that will be a major challenge for most of the Asian countries to deal with it if they have to retain their edge in economic development and many other areas of development. So some of these challenges, of course, I'll mention. I think that 21st century, the first point, is going to be destined to become an Asian century. Much of that growth can be attributed to the continent's rising population of middle-class consumers, because today one talks about consumer-led development or consumer-led growth. So if Asia can have a larger number of middle class, obviously they will spend money and they will become the main consumers. And half of the world's population will soon house half of the middle class of the world. And I think Asia is increasingly becoming the center of world economy today. Some factors contribute to this development. One, growing share of world output. China and other Asian economies are producing a larger share of world's output. The second, stronger productivity gains. Emerging Asian economies are experiencing the strongest growth among all emerging regions. Large growth differentials. China's real GDP has grown by an average of 8.4% per year over the past 20 years, while the G7 countries have averaged only 1.5%. So there's growth differentials between Asian countries, Asian country being China, India, various other countries, and the developed countries. Of course, in terms of numbers, the G7 countries already are developed countries, so the growth pattern, even if it is 2 to 3%, it is not that bad because obviously because of the volume part of it. But still, the growth differentials between the Asian countries and the developed countries, that also account for the talk about the rise of Asia. Trade and manufacturing. Asia accounted for most of the world's trade and manufacturing value added between 2015 and 2021. The next factor, foreign direct investment. Asia attracts 1/3 of the foreign direct investment to all emerging markets. By 2040, Asia could account for more than half of world's GDP and about 40% of global consumption. So that will automatically mean that Asia will be the most influential and important factor in the global order at that time. Now, in this Asia's rise or Asia's development story, China is undoubtedly the most powerful Asian country, followed by Japan, India, South Korea, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Vietnam. These countries play a significant role in shaping the region's politics and economies, and their influence is felt on a global scale. And as a result of that, it is not only going to shape its own future, but Asia is going to shape also world's future in the coming years. Now, some people are talking also about the emerging power in terms of military strength and various others. Although, to my mind, I think more than the military strength, economic power is going to be an influential factor in the coming days, because that influences the actions of many countries. One classic example would be that many of the Southeast Asian countries or Asian countries, militarily, they would like to have some kind of protection from the United States. And the defense and other kinds of military relations are very strong with the West. But in terms of economy, they are much more connected to China because of the trade and investment opportunities from that country. And the kind of capital that they need actually comes from China. And United States and other Western countries are much more spread out in the sense that they had much greater commitments to many other issues, both militarily and economically. So the result is China can take advantage of that and can spread its economic wing in these countries in a much more successful manner than the West. Now, in terms of the military strength, of course, United States still retains #1 position, followed by China. The third is Russia, and the fourth, of course, is India in terms of the military power. Now, I think some of the GDP figures, if I give, that will also support some of my arguments. And top 10 fastest growing economies in Asia in 2023, according to International Monetary Fund, and also according to one of the reports that were prepared by McKinsey. Incidentally, Macau is almost a small place, but its rate of growth is 29.16%, followed by India, 6.3%, Cambodia, 6.1%, Bangladesh, 6%, Philippines, 5.9%, Vietnam, 5.8%, Uzbekistan, 5.5% GDP growth rate. Who is the richest country in Asia? Singapore. 104,000. $600 is their per capita income, followed by Qatar. Its per capita income is 82,877, right after Singapore. Then, of course, comes Israel, United Arab Emirates, Brunei, Kuwait, Japan, South Korea. And interestingly, IMF and also McKinsey, actually, they make a projection of the kind of economy that the world will have in 2015. And it's really interesting to read some of this. And in fact, the prediction is, again, as I said, it might go differently if certain other things happen, whether Xi Jinping would be able to carry on with the kind of image that Deng Xiaoping had, and the kind of economic changes and political changes took place in China during his time. With Xi Jinping, things have changed. It has more or less come back to Mao's model of development. But, as the projection goes, China will have an economy of 58 trillion, #1, in 2050. #2, surprisingly, India, 44 trillion. #3, United States, 34 trillion. #4, Indonesia, 10 trillion. Brazil, 7 trillion. Russia, 7 trillion. Mexico, 6 trillion. Japan, 6 trillion. Germany, 6 trillion plus something in this. and then UK. So these are the predictions of International Monetary Fund, McKinsey, and various other international economic institutions that give Asia certain edge over the rest of the world in terms of their economic achievements. Now, that is the economic side that I talked about. Then I'll take the strategic part of this, rise of Asia and how, Asia is facing certain major challenges in the coming decades. I think if you look at the strategic environment in Asia, and particularly after 1970, because of the developments in US's relations with China, opening up to China, and the kind of relations that emerged in the post-Nixon period with Kissinger's visit to China and various others, China was more or less inducted into the Committee of Nations as a more responsible power. And both United States and China began to shape the emerging, regional strategic structure or the economic structure, particularly at the Asia-Pacific region. At that time, it was called Asia-Pacific, and it stopped, Asia-Pacific actually stopped at the border of Myanmar or the old-style Burma country. India was not included in Asia-Pacific at that time. India came into more prominence with a totally different, perspective from the American point of view when they started calling this region as Indo-Pacific rather than, Asia-Pacific. But there were certain changes in the perspectives of both Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. The basic structure at that time was that China and America had a certain consensus as far as the development of this region was concerned. Economic development through a capitalist model of development, and to a certain extent, the Japanese model was also which was followed by South Korea and some of the countries in the region, state-sponsored capitalism kind of thing. And the globalization was given much greater thrust during this period because of this collaboration and cooperation between the United States and China. And, the countries began to grow exponentially during this period. And there was also, unprecedented political stability in this region because there was not much of, tension. And the Asia-Pacific countries began to emerge as a source of stability. And in fact, ASEAN was created with that purpose in mind, and ASEAN began what is called as ASEAN centrality in this kind of a regional architecture of both economy and strategic environment. And there was a kind of a consensus between the United States and China how this Asian situation will develop. And in fact, all the institutions of ASEAN that grew in the 70s, 80s, and in the subsequent, particularly until about 2010, both the United States and China, in fact, gave tremendous support to the creation of much of the institutions that underwrote the kind of economic and political stability. I lived in that region during many of these periods. In fact, when ASEAN was created, I was in Jakarta. I was doing my field research for my PhD thesis during that time. And in the subsequent period, when I was teaching in the region and also visiting, many of these conferences, like the conference organized, in fact, yearly conference organized by Malaysia, which is known as the Asia-Pacific Roundtable, that used to be the annual feature. And both the Western countries and China, in fact, gave huge support, both financially as well as intellectually, in terms of creating institutions that underline the political and economic stability of this region. But this understanding between the United States and China, which laid the foundation for this kind of an emerging political and economic structure, began to crumble, particularly after the emergence of President Trump, who, the first time introduced tariffs and various others, and China-US relations began to slide down from that period. And it has not, because President Biden more or less followed the same course of actions on foreign policy in regard to China. So this US-China, breakdown of the US-China understanding is one of the strategic factors that impacted very deeply at least the political as well as the strategic aspects of this particular region, Asian region. And in fact, if you look at some of the speeches of the prime ministers or the presidents of Southeast Asia countries, particularly Japan and many others, you will see that every point, particularly from Southeast Asia, the countries are all the time talking about this loss of consensus and loss of agreement between United States and China. And for the economic and political stability, the most important factor that must be there is the return of this, And in fact, the Singapore Prime Ministers, in many of his speeches in 2021, he actually pleaded to the Western countries, and particularly to the United States, and many of his speeches in Washington, he actually appealed to them to accept China as a part of the international arrangement or the international global order, and so that China feels certain amount of happiness out of that. Because according to their perception, whether it is right or wrong, that's a different thing altogether. But at least in their perception, is that China is not challenging the existing international order. China is wanting to become a part of the international order, and because the West is not prepared to give that status to China, and that's why China is becoming aggressive. I may not agree with that view, because at least China's claim on South China Sea, almost the whole of South China Sea, does not really talk about a very sensible kind of a situation whereby it wants only to become a member of this particular international order. I think it is a challenge to this existing international order. And if one really accepts China's position in terms of its claim, which is called historical claim, everywhere China is claiming territories or waters, China talks about history. Now, to my mind, history is very explosive. History can be more explosive than the nuclear weapons. If history is accepted, then the entire world will go topsy-turvy. Now, if India starts saying that we must go back to our historical past, that means Pakistan, Bangladesh, and many of the other areas of the world will have to come to India. And I think if the Ottoman Empire at one point of time, which had occupied many of the European countries as well, and if they start talking about the past, I don't think the world can exist anymore. And China talks about actually history in that particular fashion, that maybe at some point of time in the Chinese history, they had some sort of role in a particular area. And so they think that role had established their permanent position within the world. So whatever might be the particular perception or particular differences in terms of opinion. The question is that, this breakdown of understanding between China and the United States is a major factor that might affect the future economic development as well, because now the United States had been pleading, or in fact, even India has been trying to, attract some of the supply chain things from China into the countries that are more favorable. US also wants to, make restrictions on many of the supply chain sources. And that will obviously affect the economic prospect or economic development of this region. So that is one kind of challenge that one has to remember, and the uncertainty that it poses in terms of the strategic environment of the region. If there is no peace and stability, although for the time being, it is only at the level of more claims, but in the case of South China Sea issue, Philippines has also began to assert its position, and China's naval sort of militia as well as Coast Guard, they are challenging Filipino position, and they're also shooting water cannons and various other kinds of non-military methods, the gray area drones they're using in order to harass Philippines. And Philippines is also asserting itself, and they have now given 4 more areas as bases to the United States. And military situation is changing because Philippines is also developing growing relations with many other Asian countries. With Japan, its relationship has improved considerably, particularly defense relationship has changed. And Philippines' relationship with India is also changing. India has actually given the BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. And that is a major development in terms of defense cooperation between Philippines and India. And more than, of course, India, with Japan, Australia, things are really progressing very fast. And their military relations with the United States, Japan, Australia are growing in leaps and bounds. And that will automatically affect the relationship with China. Then comes the question of, Taiwan. Now, Taiwan, of course, is considered to be, by China at least, a renegade sort of country, and it is a part of China. United States accepts the one China policy, but at the same time doesn't want China to invade Taiwan militarily. And it does give military support and various other kinds of support for maintaining its autonomy vis-a-vis China. So that's another issue. Now, in fact, in the last 1 or 2 years, a lot of developments have taken place in regard to Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and that created some kind of military sort of inactions, not in terms of invasion, but in terms of blockade and trying to sort of isolate Taiwan, and various other actions have taken place. And from time to time, China is also saying that it might, in fact, take over Taiwan even by force. But to my mind, I don't think China will invade Taiwan, because China is extremely conscious of its economic sort of future. And Taiwan is a major economic power, particularly in semiconductor and certain other areas. And it is a golden sort of egg for China. And I don't think by invading Taiwan, China will spoil its future economic. And in fact, if Taiwan is taken over, I think the economic development of that region will be badly affected, and even China will be affected very badly. The second problem which China might face in terms of Taiwan is that, invading a country and retaining it requires almost 4 to 5 times of power than an invading country, because you have to really deal with the new situations. And secondly, the amphibious landing is not that easy, because the Taiwan Strait that separates, although it's not that sort of broad and all that, but still amphibious landing would be quite difficult for China. And it has the resources to do it, but the cost and the kind of sacrifices China will have to make for that kind of a situation is going to be enormous, actually. And I don't think China is going to do that in the immediate future. What China will do is actually intimidate Taiwan so that it does not go too close to the United States, and keep keep Taiwan on a kind of a tense situation so that it does not declare independence vis-a-vis China. But then you never know. Things might change. There may be some military situation emerging, some military support that the United States gives to Taiwan might provoke China, and China might take actions in that. So there is always that uncertainty. But that uncertainty will also spell doom on China's economy and also on the future of Asia, to my mind. What is more important to my mind is, I think China will be much more focused on South China Sea. What China is going to do through this artificial creation of artificial islands and other things is creating a kind of a barrier against any military action by the United States vis-a-vis China. Denial and access is a strategy that China is going to adapt by having control over the entire South China Sea, so that United States cannot have any access to this region in case of Taiwan crisis, in case of many other crises that might occur from the US actions or the Western actions in the region. So to my mind, it will slowly and creeping occupation of South China Sea. So South China Sea is going to be a much greater fault line, to my mind, than South China Sea, than Taiwan crisis at the moment. Then, the recent war in Ukraine, although it's a European situation and European Russia invasion of Ukraine and the West commitment, NATO's tendency to expand NATO, US's, NATO's ambition to expand in this region. Already more and more countries are becoming member of NATO. So all that creates a situation which will also affect the developments in Asia. Because today, although globalization has not retained the same momentum anymore, but still anything happens in any part of the world would definitely affect the future of another part of the world. So if the war continues, one doesn't know in which direction it is moving, although West is trying to strengthen the position of Ukraine, and Ukraine is also taking major actions in terms of decapitating the Soviet strength, particularly over ships in the Red Sea and other areas. So it will have an effect on the future. Already, because of some of the Asian countries' willingness to deal with Russia in terms of buying gas and oil has already, if not antagonized US totally, but at least has hurt the United States, and they have also displayed their displeasure with many countries, like India's dealing with Russia because of its old historical links. And India can, obviously, any country would like to buy cheaper gas or cheaper oil if it is available, not giving much importance to what other countries think about it. That is the natural tendency of any country. And that you can also see how many of the Southeast Asian countries deal with China economically. Not Southeast Asia, the entire world, in fact. European countries are also dealing with China. Latin American countries, most of the countries have much greater trade with China than with the United States. Africa, whole region, and then West Asia, they're all dealing with China economically, despite the unhappiness of the United States. So that is also another source of uncertainty in terms of Asia's future. And one doesn't know what will happen. I think the next major challenge which I talked about, is the climatic change. That is one, I think, feature that might, derail many of the developments that we have been talking about. There are six key climate hazards. First one, increase in average temperature. Asia is expected to see more than 2 degrees increase in average temperature by 2050, with the magnitude and pace of warming varying across regions. It may vary, of course. Number 2, lethal heat waves because of the climatic change. Number 3, extreme precipitation, and with the risk of flooding is expected to become more common. The likelihood of such events could increase 3 to 4-fold in some parts of Asia. Number 4, severe typhoons. And I think even in the United States, you are facing climatic change and uncertain. Few days back, Houston was completely in devastation because of the kind of typhoon that is taking place. Now, the likelihood of severe typhoons is expected to triple in some parts of Asia by 2040, including in coastal areas of China, South Korea, Japan, and across all of South China Sea. Number 5, changes in water supply. And that's going to be a major crisis in future. Now, although some of these challenges are there, but Asia will be facing some of these challenges because Asia still has to develop. So obviously they cannot abandon many of the sort of things that creates the climatic change. But at the same time, Asia is growing new. Now, with new technologies have also improved. And with these new technologies, maybe Asia will be better placed to grow. May not be fully in a safe situation, but still it will have much more resilience in terms of facing the kind of challenges. The third perspective that I would like to take about the future of Asia is in terms of domestic political developments in these countries. I think the West and mostly Western countries and some of the elites who are influenced by Western thinking, they sometimes think about the derailing of democracy, human rights and loss of human rights and various other issues. But I think this is a problem which is affecting even the West. Even the West cannot really take that moral ground anymore about those issues, death of democracy or human rights, rule of law, and the kind of vindictive politics that plays in the process of many of these things. So instead of going into the details of all that, I would feel that, Asia democracy or Asian political development will take its own course rather than an imitation of the West. India or some other countries in the region have their own past of dealing with many of these social problems and other things. And I think they will try to evolve in their own way, taking much of their experience from their past civilization and cultures in shaping the future political system. And it may not be the same as it is in the West, but at the same time would be in a much better position to face the challenges of the situation that might emerge in terms of the growing conflict. And Asia is much more diverse, more ethnic ethnicities, more religious differences, more other kinds of caste and various other things. Now, some of these things are taking, in the form of identities. And everyone has to, as trying to assert their own identities. Now, in this process of assertion of identities, there is bound to be a certain amount of conflict and some sort of dislocations. And one has to evolve to deal with these things in the way Asia feels much more confident and in the much better way. So that is another change that one will have to face in the Western world also, because they have to accept that democracy cannot be the same as democracy defined by the West. Another prediction to my mind is also going to be that one of the major fault lines in the coming decades would be on religious basis. I'm not talking about, Huntington's clash of civilization, but this, assertion of identity. With that, religious identities are also changing. Islam is becoming more conservative in its approach, and that is affecting other religions also. They're also, responding to that and reacting to it. Christian evangelism, Hindu sort of chauvinism, and many other things. And another 2 decades' time, to my mind, religious differences will also be one of the major fault lines in coming Asia. And Asia will also have to, not Asia alone, but the entire world together will have to face the challenge, globally together. And I think I'll stop at this point because I've spoken exactly 45 minutes. And I'll wait for your questions.
Thank you.